Hey everybody, it's Overkill here with another Warhammer faction focus. So today, finishing off the trio of elves, we have the High Elves. So, first off, let's get into the characteristics. They are the strongest general magic they have the strongest general magic in Warhammer. What that means is, spread out across their army, they have the strongest magic in Warhammer. Now, it doesn't mean that they have the strongest casters, although that could be argued, depending on who you play as and who you look at in the lore and such, but they have the strongest magic spread across their army, and the fact that they have a lot of magic casters and they have access to a lot of different magical lores. Their army composes of ranks of spearmen backed by archers, elite infantry, amazing cavalry, and a very small selection of beasts. They have one of the largest selections of character mounts. They excel in either defense or offense. You can build armies either or, but they struggle, in the tabletop that is, to maintain both, meaning that you have to choose basically to be an offensive an attacker or a defender basically, and you build your army around that. But thankfully for the High Elves, there are many options that fill both of those roles, so they definitely don't get forced into a role that they can't act in. They have the largest selection of legendaries, lords, and heroes that we've seen so far. And sadly, in a lore perspective, they are a dying race, and as reflective of the lore, wars are costly for the High Elves more so than any other race, making expansion very difficult, if not impossible, essentially. So it's going to be interesting in Total War Warhammer when they're implemented. They might just skip that over just to make it more streamlined, which is understandable. You know, you just occupy a town and all of a sudden everybody's happy about elves and everybody turns into elves apparently, but who knows? Occupation might be a big thing in Warhammer. Hopefully it is, as it would make a lot of sense. So the next section is geography. Now, the Isle of Ulthuan is the ancestral home of the elven race, and is currently inhabited by the High Elves. Ulthuan forms a hollow ring of land surrounding an inner sea. This inner sea is accessible only at the Straits of Lothern, in the south of the island. Ulthuan is split up into provinces, each with its own character and ways of waging war. Ulthuan was shattered in the distant past during the Sundering with the Dark Elves, and much of its north and western coasts now lie underwater. The eastern approaches are protected by the Shifting Isles, a treacherous maze of magical mists and moving sandbanks. Ulthuan is also home to the majority of the world's remaining dragons, who slumber under the volcanic mountain ranges of the Dragonspine Mountains in Kaldor. Ulthuan is located off the eastern coast of the New World, near the link between Lustria and Nagaroth. The island currently lies approximately 300 miles from the New World at its nearest point. The provinces of Ulthuan are generally separated into inner kingdoms, which have part or all of their coast on the inner sea, and the outer kingdoms, which face the great ocean. The inner kingdoms are often characterized as being introverted and dreamy, while the outer kingdoms are more rugged and accustomed to warfare. Some popular ones being Kaldor, Illyrian, Avalorn, Tiranoc, Schrace, and Aetian. Long years of war against the forces of chaos, the dwarfs, and the Dark Elves have caused the steady decline of the High Elves. The cities of Ulthuan no longer bustle with life, but are mostly shells of their former glory. There are still mighty cities to be found in Ulthuan, however, such as Lothern, which is the capital of Ulthuan itself. So, with the geography and a little bit of information on how they live out of the way, we move on to society. So, since the days of Anarion, the first Phoenix King, the continent of Ulthuan has followed a loosely centralized government that is composed of 10 different smaller kingdoms, all of which are semi-autonomous, but is subject to both the Phoenix King and the Everqueen by rule of tradition and the law. These different smaller kingdoms are ruled by a collection of powerful mages or even nobles known as a prince or a princess. Unlike the traditional monarchy of other intelligent civilizations, the relationship between the Phoenix King and the Everqueen is completely different. Originally, the title of Phoenix King was meant to be inherited, where the firstborn heir, Prince Malekith, was supposed to be the next successor to the Phoenix throne. However, the other elven princes feared the dark ambition of Prince Malekith, and was thusly forced to elect one of their own as the new Phoenix King. After Malekith was banished from Ulthuan following his failed coup against the Phoenix King, the new successive line of Phoenix Kings have since all been elected into their position. Unlike the Phoenix King, the position of Everqueen is hereditary, as to follow the traditions where only those that bear the blood of the first Everqueen have any legitimacy to become one. Due to the spiritual significance of the Avalorn forest, the Everqueen is naturally also the queen of the Avalorn kingdom as well. The kingdom of Avalorn is the site of the principal shrine of Isha, the Earth Mother, also one of the gods that the Wood Elves worship above all others, which is sacred to all High Elves, with the Everqueen being the goddess' spiritual successor or avatar. As a result, the Everqueen is regarded as the spiritual leader of Ulthuan and her people, and by tradition is also the consort to the Phoenix King as well. The position of Everqueen is always granted to the firstborn daughter of the previous Everqueen, conceived during her year-long ritual marriage to the Phoenix King. After formally marrying each other, both Everqueen and Phoenix King are free to take new consorts. As such, this has ensured that the Everqueen has within her the blood of every Phoenix King that has ever ruled Ulthuan, forming an unbroken chain of bloodlines that can be traced back since the time of Anarion himself. By contrast, the Phoenix King is chosen from a number of princes, representing different kingdoms and interests, 1 year after the death of the previous Phoenix King. Every Phoenix King is crowned during a holy ceremony, held at the massive pyramidal shrine of Assyrian and attended by the legions of Phoenix Guard and the princes of Ulthuan. The current Everqueen and Phoenix King of Ulthuan are Elariel, the Radiant, and Finubar, the Seafarer. The High Elves love political intrigue, and never is the prize greater when the process of choosing the new Phoenix King starts. Usually this electoral process is held within a small cadre of high-ranking princes known simply as the Council of Princes. In this delicate time of political scheming and uncertainty, emotions commonly run hot, with many interests colliding, vying for power and control. The greatest of Ulthuan's noble families each pick their own candidate, that best fits their interests to be chosen. Also, each kingdom in Ulthuan desires the new Phoenix King to be chosen from their realm, adding extra interest into the equation. During the election process, all manner of deception and manipulation is employed to make sure the most favorable outcome happens for those who employ them. However, it is unheard of for this to escalate to violence or outright sabotage. Doing so would be considered heretical, for the Phoenix King is the chosen servant of Assyrian. Very few High Elf nobles are so obsessed with power that they could come close to believing that their creator god would ever approve of sabotaging the election, and having the candidate be chosen under dubious and destructive circumstances. The last 30 days of the year of mourning is when the election finally takes place. However, years before the reigning king has even died, does the scheming and debating really start. So we now move on to religion. The Elven pantheon gods are split up into two groups, the Kadai and the Sithare. All elves believe in this pantheon, but put a lot more emphasis on certain gods than others. An example of this is the Dark Elves outright ignoring the Kadai gods, and the High Elves shunning the Sithare gods. The peaceful, fundamental, and productive aspects of the Elven pantheon, such as crafting, smithing, motherhood, farming, or hunting, are represented by the Kadai. The High Elves openly worship and revere the Kadai, building large temples and shrines to profess their faith. Above all other gods is Assyrian, the creator, who the High Elves worship the most, as the Phoenix King is the mere servant of him. Then come the rulers of Mirai, the Elven underworld, the Sithare. Many Sithare gods are shunned by the vast majority of the High Elves, while for some of the Sithare the High Elves attempt appeasement. However, even though worshipping the Sithare gods in Ulthuan is either frowned upon or totally outlawed depending on the deity in question, some individuals still do privately worship them. For a High Elf to worship Cain, the Lord of Murder, who is the Dark Elf's primary god, is to ask to be put to death on the spot. On the other hand, the worship of Mathlan, the god of the deeps, is common among elf mariners. At one point, according to elven legend, some of the gods walk the mortal world, which one specifically is contested. The deities of the High Elves are actually represented by a circular rune pattern called the Pantheotic Mandala. Assyrian, being the most important god to the High Elves, would be placed in the center, while the others spiral outwards in an order of greatest to least. In secret, some elves turn to the worship of Slaanesh out of a desire to appease it, so their souls could be spared. Elven worship is greatly desired by Slaanesh, for elves experience emotions deeper than any other race. This creates the excess for which Slaanesh desires, for it gives Slaanesh power. The worship of Slaanesh and any other chaos gods is strictly forbidden in Ulthuan. The penalty for doing so is death. To keep chaos cults from growing within High Elf society, the Swordmasters of Hoeth work diligently to root out and destroy any cult and cult members found. So, just like the Dark Elves, you can see that the High Elves have a little bit of a problem in terms of religion, where some people worship the underworld gods when they should be worshipping the Kadai, and some people have even turned to chaos, or some elves rather, have turned to chaos, which is not good. So, chaos is definitely going to be a problem for the High Elves in Total War Warhammer. I would assume that rebellions and public order would be a problem for anybody that's affected by Slaanesh. So, yeah, but now that we have that out of the way, we are going to move on to the military. So, of course, I have the roster on the screen right now, and you can see it right now. So, like I mentioned in the characteristics, this army has the largest amount of lords and heroes, and probably the most amount of mounts that we've seen as well. A very, very widespread army, a very versatile army as well. So first off, of course, I'm going to tell you the legendary lords, but we will go into detail with them later. So first of all, we have Elariel, the Everqueen, the current Everqueen. We have Tyrion, who is a mighty High Elf general. His brother Teclis, which is the most powerful wizard basically in the High Elf army. Of course, Alariel is also very powerful. We have Alethanar, which is the leader of the Shadow Warriors, and we have Eltharion, which is another general. Of course, we'll get into all of them later. So let's just get right into the lords. So first we have the Prince. Now the Prince, as we mentioned earlier, are one of the 10 rulers of Ulthuan, essentially, or not the rulers, but more of a governor of Ulthuan. They make up the Council of Princes, and it's one of these that will become the Phoenix King. And as you can see, there is no Phoenix King Legendary Lord, which is very interesting, that GW has never made a Legendary Lord model. So basically, okay, I should have mentioned this earlier. I believe, or actually it's not even that I believe, it's quite obvious that Alariel is the faction leader for the High Elves, because it even says that she is the spiritual leader of Ulthuan, essentially, and all the people. So she'll be the faction leader, just like Karl Franz and Thorgrim Grudgebearer, essentially, of the other races. So of course she'll have special stuff for her and stuff because of being the faction leader and all that. But yeah, it's the princes that become the Phoenix King, and get the fun times with the Everqueens, of course, like we mentioned earlier. But yeah, these are going to be just your melee guys buffing morale and such. It's going to be quite cool. We then have the Archmage, which is considerably one of the best mages in Warhammer. They have access to 9 lores of magic, that being the 8 lores of battle magic and their own high magic. And yeah, like I said, they're considered to be up there with the strongest of casters. Not quite as good as Slann, of course, from the Lizardmen, but they're still really up there. We then have the Anointed of Assyrian, which is the leader of the Phoenix Guard, or at least a group of Phoenix Guard. Karad Ryan, who is a hero character, is the leader of the Anointed, I believe, or he's a special version of the Anointed. I'm not quite sure, but either way. Or maybe he's the Anointed of Assyrian, but the Anointed is just a generic version of him. Whatever. Either way, it's the leader of the Phoenix Guard, and these are just going to be absolute beasts on the battlefield, because they're going to be the absolute best fighters that you have, essentially, and they're going to be able to take on a lot of stuff by themselves. They can also be mounted on phoenixes, and we'll get to phoenixes later. We then have the Lore Master of Hoeth, and you may be wondering, well, okay, we have the Archmage at Lords, or the Archmage, whatever, and the Lore Master. So what is this? It's another mage, but instead of having access to the lores, the spells that he knows are all the signature spells. Now, to describe this in terms of gameplay, in the Warhammer tabletop, every lore has a signature spell, meaning that, okay, well, first of all, depending on the level that you are, you roll dice, and yeah, 1 to 4, you roll 1 to 4 dice. And whatever dice you roll, you get a certain spell out of a lore. There are 6 spells per lore. If you don't like one of the spells that you get, you can replace it with the signature that every lore has. So the Lore Master of Hoeth has access to all 8 of the signature spells from the the lores of battle, which is very interesting. And the signatures are also very powerful. So him knowing all 8 of them is very good. And it'll be interesting if the Archmage and the Lore Master are introduced. I would imagine that they would. But who knows? But they are, of course, very powerful. So we then move on to heroes, and first of all, we have the Noble. So the Noble is just a more generic version of the Prince, essentially. He's going to be the same thing, melee, boosting morale. But these are more of like a captain kind of rank, like they're going to be the captain slot of an army more than actually like a leader of Ulthuan. Stuff like that. So we then have the Dragon Mage of Kaldor, and you may be wondering what's so special about him. Well, on the tabletop, he has access to the Lore of Fire, and that's it. So you may be wondering, Overkill, why is he anything special? Well, in the tabletop, he comes standard with a Sun Dragon, which is another one of the mounts that we have down below. So, yeah, he comes standard with a dragon, which on the tabletop doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing. He's very expensive for a hero. But in Warhammer, Total War Warhammer, if they choose to just give him a dragon straight up, it would be very interesting, and it would make him very powerful, as we know that flying mounts are very powerful already in Total War Warhammer from what we've just seen. So it's going to be really interesting to see him. So next we have the Handmaidens of the Everqueen, and the Handmaidens of the Everqueen are a warrior guard sworn to live and die in the service of the Mistress, which is the Everqueen. And they're just basically, although it's a hero in Warhammer, in the lore they make up a bodyguard for her. But in this, they're just going to be more of a support kind of character. They have access to a bow and a spear, so they're going to be very good in in fighting in general. They're going to be able to pick off some things with their bow, and yeah, they don't have any magic abilities, so they're not really going to be casting anything or being super useful. But of course, they will be powerful on the battlefield, and who knows, they might be very useful on the campaign map if they are added. Because the High Elves have a lot of characters, so I'm not quite sure if all of them are going to make it in, but who knows, they might. So next we have the Lothern Sea Helm. Now these are basically the heroes and the leaders of the Lothern Sea Guard, which are a fighting force that are located or are added to the main High Elf army from the capital Lothern. They are very powerful, and of course they're going to just add morale and be very powerful. They have access. They hold a spear and a bow and a shield, and they have access to a specific mount, the Lothern Sky Cutter. More on that later as we get down to it. But yeah, another just basic melee support kind of character. Then finally for heroes we have just the normal mage. They have access to the 9 lores as mentioned before, the high and the other 8. And they can just be mounted on steeds and Terranok chariots. Again, more on those later. So yeah, just another mage. Of course, these mages, since they're high elves, are up there with the other race's strongest magic casters. But you know, to the high elves, they're considered, you know, lower than the normal ones. So that is the lords and heroes. So now we have mounts. So we have elven steeds, which are of course just the bog standard steed for the high elves. They're faster than most other races' horses, and they're quite powerful, although not very heavily armored compared to maybe some other factions rather. We then have the Great Eagle, which we talked about in the Wood Elves video. These are basically just big eagles that, of course, if you think about, like I said in the Wood Elves video, if you think about the Lord of the Rings eagles, they're basically the same as that. We have griffins. Now, don't go thinking about Deathclaw griffins. These are a different breed of griffin, basically, altogether. The model I'll be showing you, you can see it's quite smaller than the one that Deathclaw, which is Carl Franz's griffin, looks like. But they are still very powerful, and of course, a lot of the characters and heroes and lords have access to them, so that's going to be interesting. Then we have the 3 dragons, the Sun, Moon, and Star Dragon. Now, this is just relative to their age. The youngest dragons are the Sun Dragons. They're smaller, less powerful. We have Moon Dragons, which are older and wiser and stack up to the other race's dragon-type monsters. And then we have the Star Dragon. So, while any dragon can savage an entire regiment of warriors, tear a manticore apart, or rip the head off a wyvern, a Star Dragon is so physically powerful that it can battle against even the greater demons of chaos and prevail. So, anybody who has access to a Star Dragon is definitely very powerful, and Star Dragons are going to be absolutely terrifying in Total War Warhammer. So now that we have that out of the way, we can move on to melee infantry. So first off, for melee infantry, we have spearmen. So high elf spearmen, after a decade or so of being an archer, a high elf will become a spearman. Fighting with a spear and a shield, this is the senior arm of the militia, and are expected to fight bravely in the main line of battle. Spearmen wear light armor and shields. Spearmen train so that they can fight an opponent with as many of them as possible without getting in each other's way. So high elf spearmen are going to be the bulk of your army. They are quite good in terms of other people's infantry, but their main role really is to just soak up the brunt of the enemy's attack, or to engage the enemy and let your other units destroy them essentially, or even to protect your ranged units, let's say that. They aren't the greatest warriors, of course. They are part of a militia, as mentioned in the little description, which we'll get to the rest of when we talk about the archers, but they are definitely still a powerful enough unit on their own. Next we have the Lothern Sea Guard. The province of Etain does not field a citizen militia as all the other provinces do, instead contributing the Lothern Sea Guard to the army. Unlike the normal levy, they are not only called upon in times of need, but remain at arms at all times. They form a corps of marines to crew ships that patrol the seas around Ulthuan and its colonies, but also fight on land. They wear light armor, carry shields, and wield both bow and spear. The Sea Guard also protect the Ulthuan capital city of Lothern, and crew the repeater bolt throwers and the elegant Lothern sky cutters. So these are a more elite infantry corps. They are a force that is always at arms. They aren't sent home. They aren't a militia. They are a trained fighting force. So these guys are going to be a bit of an elite infantry, but they can also form corps of your army depending on what you want to pay, essentially, and what kind of upkeep you want to deal with. We then have the Sword Masters of Hoeth. The Swordmasters of Hoeth are experts with a blade, especially when wielding their finely balanced ceremonial greatswords. These expert warriors are the guardians of the White Tower and serve as protectors of the mages and scholars who live and study there. They study the secret ways of battle, honing their bodies and skills to unbelievable levels. In battle they are deadly opponents, eager to practice their legendary skills on real enemies, in an arena where there is no room for second best. This is the true test of mettle, skill, and honor that they eagerly seek out. So the Swordmasters of Hoeth are basically some of your more elite infantry that the High Elves have access to. There still are some units that are better than them, but these are your first main, very elite units. So these guys are going to be just shock infantry, essentially. You're going to be charging them into the back, or even the front if you really want to, of the enemy, and their two-handed swords are just going to absolutely rip people apart. And of course, since they are elves, they are going to be able to swing those just as fast as any person using any weapon, really. So they're going to be absolutely devastating to the enemy, depending on what they're fighting, of course. We then have the White Lions of Schrace. Ever since the time of Calidor I, the closest bodyguards of the Phoenix Kings have come from the wildest forests of Schrace. Each must demonstrate his skill and bravery by tracking down one of the fierce white lions that roam the barren mountains and dark forests of the land. When they find one, they must kill it through hand-to-hand combat and take its pelt. In battle, the White Lions use the traditional woodman's axe of Schrace, a finely crafted weapon that is said to be sharp enough to hew a tree or a man in half with a single strike. So like the Swordmasters, these are going to be a very heavy shock infantry, essentially. Those two-handed axes are going to be absolutely devastating. And again, like I said with the Swordmasters, they are elves, so they're going to be swinging those just as fast as anybody around, swinging their one-handed weapons and such, so it's going to be absolutely devastating. They're going to be able to chop through many people. But like any High Elves unit, they're not extremely armored. The damage that they take is going to be bad for them. Many of them will die quite quickly if the enemies actually have a chance to attack them. So to finish off melee infantry, we have the Phoenix Guard. Known as the Phoenix Guard, the main duty of these warrior monks is to protect the island's shrine and all those who make their pilgrimage there. In battle, they can always be found where the fighting is in its most desperate state, knowing in advance if they shall fall or if they shall be victorious. The Phoenix Guard fight with their ceremonial halberds, clad in cloaks of embroidered fire that echo the sacred flame of Assyrian. They move throughout the battlefield in utter silence, accompanied only by the beat of a solemn drum. This unnatural manner is deeply disturbing for their enemies, as even the direst of wounds will not make them cry out. So these are the most elite unit that the High Elves have to offer, and they are absolutely devastating. They'll be able to take loads of damage. You can see that they're basically immune to pain, as they do not cry out from being hurt. And those halberds they have are going to be absolutely devastating, just like the Swordmasters and the White Lions. They're just going to be swinging those around, just destroying units of fodder and elite units alike. And they're just going to be really tough to take down. And of course, they have probably unbreakable morale in Total War Warhammer, as they know they're going to be charging into the direst situations, knowing either if they're going to die or win. So if they already know that they're going to die and they still do it anyway, they're going to have some really good morale. So we then move on to the next section, which is ranged infantry. So first off, we have High Elf archers. The majority of warriors in the armies of the High Elves are citizen militia rather than professional soldiers, but are quicker, braver, and better trained than the average human soldier. This militia is a form of part-time army in which all take their turn to serve, every elf providing his own war gear in defense of Ulthuan. When young elves first join the militia, they will begin as archers, fighting with longbows and wearing light armor. This allows them to gain warrior experience from a relatively safe distance. So these and spearmen essentially are going to make up the bulk of your army. Really, if you want to have lots of elite infantry, you'll probably want to go for High Elf archers as another bulk. Making up most of your army as archers and then having a lot of elite infantry would be a very decent army build. And the archers have longbows, of course, so they're going to be absolutely devastating. High Elves have pretty much some of the best ranged in the game in terms of their weapons and their aim and such. So they're going to be very powerful, a very powerful cheap ranged unit. We then next have the Shadow Warriors. Now, Shadow Warriors, even in times of relative peace, the Shadow Warriors are never at rest. They constantly patrol the barren shores and bleakest hills as they watch for the inevitable Dark Elf raiders. The Shadow Warriors are intense and brooding, proud and warlike, and this has made them little trusted by their fellow kin of Ulthuan. Despite this, they are among the most loyal subjects of the Phoenix King, and the tales of their daring and dangerous exploits are many in number. So these are going to be a scouting kind of a scouting unit that can deliver devastating blows to enemy units. They're also going to be very reliable in combat, as they are a very well trained and powerful unit. So these are gonna be guys that are going to be hidden basically everywhere, and who knows, like Total War Artillery, they may have the snipe ability so that people can't see them when they're firing, who knows, but they're going to be able to pick off people very easily. One unit of these guys versus like a bunch of goblins, they'd probably be able to just destroy them, so that's going to be very entertaining to see. We then have the Sisters of Averlorn. These are the guardians of Averlorn and the Everqueen herself. They constantly watch over the sacred places of Averlorn, making sure the beasts who dwell in the tainted reaches do not stray, swiftly killing them if they do. The Sisters of Averlorn are picked by the Everqueen's personal decree out of the citizen militia, and like the Everqueen, they are incorruptible. In battle, they wield magical bows that fire bolts of white-blue flame. There is no foe the Sisters of Averlorn cannot handle. So these are going to be your most elite archer unit. They are going to be absolutely devastating, as just imagine... Just imagine like Bow Hero from Shogun 2. They're going to be crazier than that. They're going to be firing these magic arrows that just burn and destroy everything that they hit. And of course, being the guardians of the Everqueen, they are going to be very powerful when she's around, I would imagine. And yeah, the High Elves are just going to be really scary to go up against. The mix of magic and range is just going to be absolutely devastating for all the slower foot-slogging races. We then have artillery in the form of the Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower. So, the Repeater Bolt Thrower, or Eagle's Claw, as it is usually called, is a versatile weapon and by far the most common war machine in High Elf armies. It is lightly made, though sturdy and strong, and is practical and portable. This makes it highly adaptable and is widely used both on ship and on shore. In battle, the Eagle's Claw needs only 2 crew to operate, and unlike other bolt throwers, can shoot 2 different types of bolts, either a single spear-sized bolt or a hail of smaller bolts. So this is the one and only artillery for the High Elves, and it's going to be absolutely devastating. As you can see, it has an option to fire a big bolt or a bunch of smaller bolts, so it's going to be a bit of like a grape shot bolt thrower, which is going to be very interesting. And of course, the bolts, you know, ballistas from the older games, the bolts flying through units are going to be really devastating on tightly packed infantry, and it's going to be very entertaining to see them get hit by them, if I do say so myself. We then move on to cavalry. So first we have Silver Helm Knights. Silver Helms are the sons of High Elven nobles. They are called Silver Helms for their Ethelmar helmets, which they decorate with metal showing what monsters they've slain and deeds they've done. They are normally equipped with heavy armor, shields, and lances on barded elven steeds. So these are going to be a mix of a shock and melee cav unit, as there aren't really any dedicated melee cav in the High Elves unit roster, so these guys are going to be really dangerous on the charge. They're going to be charging out their lances, and they're just going to be impaling things as they charge into the back of them, which is going to be very cool to see. And of course, they are heavily armored, their horses are barded, so they're going to be very tough, of course. We then have Illyrian Reavers, and these are light cavalry from the province of Illyrian. They frequently use bows, either as a replacement or in addition to their spears, to harass their foes on unbarded elven steeds. They are exceptionally skilled riders and can shoot their bow in all directions, including behind. So, again, guys, I've mentioned this before. If you thought Warhammer, you were going to get away from horse archers, you were wrong. These guys are going to be very annoying, as elven steeds are some of the fastest horses in the game. And yeah, mix that with elven archery, and you've got a very dangerous unit. So these guys are going to be absolutely amazing, very important to any high elf army, just to harass enemy units and weaken them with their bows. And of course, as it said, they can shoot behind them, so Parthian shot's going to be a thing. So that's going to be great. And then we have the third High Elf Cavalry unit. We have the Dragon Princes of Caledor. Now these are going to be the elite High Elf Cavalry. Long ago, Dragon Princes fought on the back of great dragons, but now the dragons sleep and they ride to battle on horses instead. Proud, arrogant, but extremely skilled, able to impale 2 people with 1 lance thrust. They are very elite heavy cavalry originating from the province of Caledor. The suits of dragon armor that they wear are extremely resilient against heat, even being able to survive dragon fire. It has been prophesies that a great battle will come in which the dragon princes will ride to war on the back of the great drakes one last time. So these guys are going to be very powerful. They're going to be resistant to fire magic. As you can see, they can survive dragon fire. So that's going to be very interesting. Any lower fire mages are going to be kind of inefficient against the dragon princes, and they are just going to be able to flatten entire units by themselves. And we've already seen from gameplay of Total War Warhammer that cavalry charges are absolutely devastating in this game. We've seen pretty much units get destroyed by people charging, so this is going to be awesome. So next we have the Lion Chariot of Shrace. The Lion Chariots of Shrace are the more brutish and savage of the two high elf chariots. The crew manning the chariot are the White Lions, or less commonly, the Hunters of Shrace. The chariot is pulled by two lions, raised from the cubs of wild lions the hunters have killed. The chariot's superior design allows the crews to use their huge axes to cleave foes in half. Unlike the elven steeds of the Terranok chariot, the lions are more than capable of breaking the most determined shield while tearing into the foes behind it with tooth and claw. So mix lions, huge lions if you look at the models, with the white lions swinging their axes, and you have an absolutely deadly chariot. These are just going to be breaking through enemy lines, swinging their axes around. The lions are going to be ripping people apart. It's going to be absolutely devastating, and from the model you can see that they look really, really cool, and you can see why they're called white lions. We then have the Terranok chariot. A few charioteers are all that remain of the ancient way of war of the Terranok nobility. In ages past, the coastal plains of the realm were full of herds of noble steeds and racing charioteers. Then the sundering came, and the once fair land of Terranok sank below the waves of Ulthuan Sea. Not all was lost, however. Indeed, many of their finest warriors were elsewhere fighting against the evil minions of the Witch King. They now serve in any of the High Elves' armies, especially those that fight the Dark Elf kin, and will travel many days and nights to join a force on the road to war. So these are going to be your just basic chariots. They're pulled by horses. The crew are going to be shooting at people with bows and stabbing them with spears and such, and the horses of course can trample over people and run into them and such, but of course it definitely won't be as powerful as the lion chariot. So then we finally, for the cavalry, if you can call it that, it's more of a war machine, but we have the Lothern Sky Cutter. When the swift hawk ships of Lothern slip through their moorings, they are accompanied to the open sea by sky cutters, sleek airborne chariots that rest upon a cushion of magic and are drawn into battle by the swift feather hawks that nest along the glittering coast. These hawk ships can be fitted with the eagle-eye boat throwers that, despite being compact, are still capable of punching through dragon scale. So these are going to be shooting down bolts at the enemy, so these things are going to be really devastating if you don't have anything to deal with them, essentially, because they're going to be swooping around. Of course, the hawk could swoop down and attack people, and the bolt thrower is just going to be raining down fire on your troops and such if you don't have something to take it out. So you definitely want to focus on stuff like that if you know you're going to be fighting the High Elves. And of course, they can be mounts for Lothern Sea Helms as well, as I mentioned earlier. So then for the final section, we have monsters. Now for monsters, we have phoenixes. So first off, we have the Flame Spire Phoenix. The Flame Spire Phoenixes of Ulthuan dwell amongst the Flame Spire, great alabaster pillars of rock that stand sentinel about the Shire of Assyrian. Actually, the Wind of Fire has left its marl on more than the Silent Stones. Over generations, the phoenixes of the Flame Spires have become attuned to fire magic, harnessing it at whim. These very intelligent and deadly creatures have a very unique alliance with the High Elves, often being called by the Phoenix Guard to act as mounts. So Flamespire Phoenixes actually have access to magic, and they have flaming attacks. So against things like trolls that have regeneration, they're going to be very powerful, and they're going to be able to just wreck those guys. But they can actually cast magic. They have their own magical spells, which is quite interesting. We then have the Frostheart Phoenixes. As a Flamespire Phoenix ages, its body cools and even begins to sap heat from its surroundings. Finally, the plumage that once blazed with fire grows heavy with frost and ice. Once this occurs, the Phoenix must leave the Flamespires, for the chill that surrounds it causes agony in its brightly burning kin. Most such Frostheart Phoenixes dwell in lonely exile on crags about the Atane coast, until their bodies finally freeze solid, to leave curious frozen statues along the crags and cliff tops. Others return to the Shrine of Assyrian to offer their final days in service as war steeds. Whilst the Frostheart Phoenix may not possess the vigor and fire it commanded in its youth, it is a much hardier mount. The ice that sheaths its form is as hard as glass, and enemies not having the benefit of the rider's enchanted armor find their own strength and resolve eaten away by its chill presence. Knowing they can no longer resurrect themselves in magical fire, the Frostheart Phoenixes fight even harder in the defense of their homeland, determined to end their existence striking a final blow amongst the enemies of Ulthuan. So the Frostheart Phoenixes are not magic, but they do have an aura that slows down the enemy units and makes them less strong. So the High Elves are going to have a huge advantage over enemy units, as they're already quite fast. But if these units are already slowed, the High Elves are just going to rip through everybody, and they're not going to be able to be stopped, basically. And of course, the natural armor of the ice makes them very tough, and they are mounts as well. So very interesting. We then have Great Eagles, and as mentioned earlier, these are just generic fantasy Great Eagles. Think about Lord of the Rings, for example, the big eagles. They're going to be swooping around, picking things up and dropping them, and biting them with their beaks and scratching them with their claws, and being mounts for people, essentially. So that is the High Elves roster, guys, as long as that was. My goodness. We then move on to the Legendary Lords. So the first Legendary Lord that we're going to talk about is Alarielle the Radiant, the current Everqueen of the High Elves. So she is going to be the faction leader of the High Elves. There's no doubt about that. I believe none of the other Legendary Lords outrank her. The only one that would kind of, it's not even really outranking, even if it was a Phoenix King as a Legendary Lord. But all the other characters are either generals or just, you know, leaders of armies or very powerful wizards and such. So Alarielle will be the faction leader. She has access to magic. She is a very powerful caster, and she has access to the lore's high life and light magic. So not just choosing one of those, she can have spells from all of them if she so chooses. So she's going to be a very powerful caster, and like we've seen with Manfred having access to vampires and death or shadows, I believe, she's going to be able to cast from multiple selections of spells, which is going to be really cool. Now, they have all these characters have quite a few magical items, so we'll just talk about them quickly. Alarielle has the Star of Avalorn, the Staff of Avalorn, and the Shield Stone of Isha. So, the Star of Avalorn heals friendly units, or she can heal herself. The Stave of Avalorn allows her to cast an already used spell, even if it was miscast or failed to cast. This is on the tabletop, of course. So, in Total Warhammer, just make her probably a stronger wizard or something. And the Shield Stone of Isha gives her a ward save, which is a save that she can use against anything, essentially. Armor can be ignored by very strong attacks. So her having a ward save makes sure that she always has that. And it also gives it, she also gives it to her unit that she joins. Against non-magical attacks. Now, we have no idea if units... it's pretty clear that heroes can't join units in Total War Warhammer. They haven't shown that. They haven't talked about it. So, probably not going to happen, but at least it makes her tougher. Alright, we then have Tyrion, the Defender of Ulthuan. Tyrion is one of the greatest warriors and generals of the High Elves army. He is the twin brother of Teclis, which is another legendary lord, and he is just a little bit important in the end times, but of course Total War Warhammer is taking place before that, so we won't mention stuff like that, but he is quite the badass, and he does do some pretty impressive things. Prince Tyrion is, according to the majority of the High Elves, the greatest living warrior and general in Ulthuan, and possibly even the world. His twin brother Teclis is the total opposite of Tyrion, however. Where Tyrion is strong, tall, brave, and handsome, Teclis is weak, diminutive, mockingly sarcastic, and gaunt. But don't be fooled into thinking that Teclis is a complete waste of time, for he is one of the mightiest mages in the Warhammer world. Tyrion and Teclis played pivotal parts in the Great Chaos Incursion, the so-called Storm of Chaos, especially at the Battle of Finneville Plain. He is currently the champion and consort of the current Everqueen. So, yeah, he has access to some pretty cool magical items as well. First is the Heart of Avalorn, which gives him resistance to magic, and also can save him from death once. If he's brought down to his final health, it can bring him back, or final wound, and if that's taken away on a roll, this is the tabletop, of course, on a roll of 2+, he comes back. So basically you have to be very unlucky for him to actually die, but the Heart of Avalorn is removed if it succeeds, so obviously it only works once. He then has his Dragon Armor of Anarion, which improves his armor, of course, just like most armor does, and it gives him a ward save. He also gets very, very, very resistant to flaming attacks due to this armor. He then also has his sword, Sunfang, which causes has flaming attacks, and once per battle in the tabletop, he can actually make a breath attack, which is kind of like a flamethrower. So in Warhammer, he may have access to what we've seen in the old versions of the Battle of Blackfire Pass with Thorgrim's Ring, where he would shoot a fireball and it would explode and kill a bunch of stuff. So we'll probably see him be able to do that as well with his with Sunfang. So we then move on to Teclis, and as I mentioned, Teclis is the twin brother of Tyrion. Teclis, the High Lore Master of the White Tower, is the most powerful of all the High Elf Archmages, and arguably one of the most powerful magic casters in the Warhammer world. Some say he is on par with the great Nagash of Nehakara, and Morathi the Hag Sorceress, and even the great Kalador Dragon Tamer. Some say, however, that the curse of Anarion run through him, and that he may succumb to the temptations of darkness. Teclis is the twin brother to the famous High Elf warrior prince Tyrion. The age-old curse on the line of Anarion affected Tyrion's twin brother Teclis more strongly. Where his brother was mighty, he was weak. Where Tyrion was golden-skinned and yellow-maned, Teclis was pale, dark, and gaunt. Where Tyrion was fair-spoken and noble-minded, Teclis was caustic-tongued and bitter. From birth he was sickly and consumptive. To this day, Teclis needs to consume potions to keep himself strong. Despite his burdens, Teclis cares deeply for his brother and fights alongside him. Teclis is the greatest sorcerer in this age of the world, a mage so powerful that spells and magic items are named after him. He is the High Lore Master of the White Tower of Hoeth. Teclis has used his mastery of magic to fight against the forces of chaos countless times, and has saved Ulthuan from destruction on many occasions. So yeah, Teclis is just a little bit powerful. So of course, since he is an Archmage, he has access to the lores of battle magic, so that is what we mentioned earlier with the, he has the same abilities as the Lore Master of Hoeth, where he can use the signature spells of all the 8 lores of magic, or he can just choose to go with high magic. And he has some magical items known as the Moonstaff of Lilith, the Scroll of Hoeth, the Sword of Teclis, and the War Crown of Safari. So first off, we have the Moonstaff of Lilith. This adds more power for every cast in the phase that it is used. So it's a one-use only thing on the tabletop, so probably just in Total War Warhammer it's just going to be a buff forever, or for the entire battle. But it makes his spells more powerful, or he can ignore the result of a miscast. So he probably, I don't know how they're going to balance it for Total War Warhammer. He might be able to ignore miscasts altogether and be more powerful, I'm not quite sure, but it has a draining effect on him. So in both cases, as mentioned above, Teclis has Strength 1 and Toughness 1 for the rest of the game, which basically makes him useless in everything other than magic. So he'd be very easy to kill. So it just drains the power from him. So you definitely don't want to be doing that You definitely don't want to be doing that unless it's absolutely necessary. We then have the Scroll of Hoeth, which counts as a Dispel Scroll, which in the tabletop, a Dispel Scroll just instantly gets rid of a spell as soon as it's used, if you so choose. But both Teclis and the enemy caster roll a d6. If Teclis wins the roll, then the spell cast is removed from the game. Now, what that means is, in the tabletop, if Teclis wins that roll, that the enemy caster can't cast that spell anymore. So in Total War Warhammer, it's probably not going to work that way. It's going to be interesting to see how all of these magic items work. And then the War Crown of Safari just makes him a better wizard. It adds 1 wizard level to him in the tabletop. And then we have the Sword of Teclis, and all hits wound on a 2+, so he's wounding people really easily, hurting them, and there's no armor saves allowed. So it ignores armor, and it's a very strong sword that can kill people basically just by pretty much every result except for a 1 on a dice kills people. So he's going to be very strong, and again, no armor. It's going to be quite interesting to see that. I'm trying to get through these guys as fast as possible because there are a lot. We then have Aleth Anar, and Aleth Anar is the Shadow King, and he formed the group known as the Shadow Warriors. We talked about the Shadow Warriors earlier, which specialize in guerrilla warfare deep behind enemy lines. He is the bearer of the Moonbow, a mythical bow of terrible power that is said to have belonged to Kurnos, the elven god of hunting. His merciless presence is enough to strike fear into the heart of the most evil of dark elves. So Aleth is going to be quite interesting, and he has access to some cool abilities. So first we have the Shadow Crown. So Aleth and the unit he is with have Swift Stride. Now in the tabletop, Swift Stride just makes charges easier, so depending on what unit he's with, it really helps. But in Warhammer or Total War, again, characters aren't joining units, so I'm not quite sure how that's going to be put in. He has the Stone of Midnight, which gives him a ward save, which again is a save that he always has, so it just makes him tougher essentially. And shooting at his unit and him is harder to do, so it protects them from ranged fire. And he also has the moon bow, which acts as a bolt thrower as opposed to a normal bow. So he's going to be shooting like a bolt thrower essentially, and it has it gives a debuff to Dark Elves as well that it hits. So that's pretty cool. We then move on to the final legendary, and that's Eltharion the Grim. So Eltharion is another great general of the High Elves. And yeah, in the 260th year of the reign of the Phoenix King Funabar, which is the current one, so around 2423, which is about like 100 years or so before Total War is going to be taking place, he led the only successful High Elf raid on Nagaroth. He used Illyrian Reavers and Shadow Warriors to great effect to intercept messengers and destroy watchtowers, leaving the Witch King uninformed of the attacks. Dressed in captured garb, Eltharion's soldiers entered the city of Nagarond and opened the gates from within. He was nearly killed by the poison weapons of a witch elf during the attack, but managed to escape with his army before organized resistance was met. He survived and sailed home to Ulthuan. Later, Eltharion fought in the defense of Anlek, though he was defeated and captured by the Witch King, who tortured and eventually blinded the noble elf. Malekith sent the crippled elf back to Ulthuan and the Phoenix King as an example of Malekith's cruelty and hatred of the High Elves. Despite being blind, Eltharion became one of the best fighters in Ulthuan, having been trained by the Swordmasters. Using touch, smell, and hearing, he bested every elf he comes across. So, Eltharion is blind, and he's quite a grim fellow, as his nickname would suggest. So he's definitely going to be a badass. He also has access to his personal mount, which is Stormwing the Griffin. So he's going to be having his own griffin, so you can see that, of course, in the picture. And that's going to make him quite powerful. So he has some magical items. First would be the Talisman of Hoeth, which gives him magical resistance and also gives him access to casting magic from any of the 8 lores. So he's going to be quite cool. He has the Helm of Ivres, which is a ward save for him and Stormwing, which kind of doesn't make sense that his helmet's protecting Stormwing, but you know, that's Warhammer. And he has the Fang Sword of Eltharion, which is extremely strong and has the stats of a great weapon, and no armor saves are allowed from it, so he's going to be cutting through people just no problem. He also has a longbow, so he can shoot some people. So yeah, guys, that has been the High Elves video. We talked about all the legendary lords. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Sorry this one dragged on a bit longer than the other ones. There was quite a bit to talk about, but anyway, guys, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.